10th of November, 32nd Sunday in Ordinary Time, Remembrance Sunday. Sermon on Mark chapter 12, verses 38 to 44, Psalm 127, verse 1, and Hebrews chapter 9, verses 24 to 28. The story of the widow's mite in the Gospels is well known. It's usually told to demonstrate how the smallest offering is precious to the Lord and can be of use to him. The poorest person can offer a tiny gift, a few precious minutes of time, a meaningful prayer, or simply a friendly smile, and it could work a miracle. With God, the sky is the only limit. However, the context of this story also reveals another important teaching, that the generous gifts of the wealthy are often of little value to God because they do not come from generous hearts, but are simply an offloading of surplus, barely if at all noticed by the giver. The first part of our reading in Mark's Gospel concerns Jesus' teaching on the virtue signalling by the religious leaders of Israel. Jesus observed how they made themselves conspicuous with flowing robes, walking through the market squares and expecting to be recognized and greeted, taking the front seats in the synagogues and the top table at banquets. In their religious observance, they would draw attention to their piety with lengthy prayers. Perhaps Jesus is hinting at a lack of sincerity in what they do. Such behaviour is almost ubiquitous now as then. One has only to flick through the pages of Hello magazine, or even just glance at the front cover to see pictures of celebrities at charity dinners, red carpets, seats of honour, or state occasions with everyone pouring into cathedrals and abbeys with more attention to fashion than of faith. For the wealthy, it is so easy to make an apparently generous gift that in reality costs nothing. Such offerings are often lauded as incredible, when in fact they represent no sacrifice at all. I'm particularly struck by the greenwashing that is practiced at events such as the annual COP meetings, at which wealthy individuals trumpet their green credentials before getting into a private jet or a luxury car that they've had specially flown out for the event. It is not just greed that is in focus. It's been estimated by Oxfam that the lifestyles of the 1% of the world's wealthiest individuals contribute more environmental damage than 2/3 of the world's total population, and that their carbon emissions annually are enough to cause 1.3 million excess deaths due to heat. Jesus would have seen nothing like that as he sat near the temple treasury, watching the gifts being thrown in. But he saw the equivalent, having already observed how the religious leaders, for all their outward show, would exploit widows and other needy people. As gifts were made, the extravagant amounts of money would have made a huge crash as they were thrown in. There was no paper money or cheques in those days, and people would no doubt have turned to see who had given so lavishly, whereas meagre offerings would have made little or no sound. We imagine the 2 very small copper coins donated by the widow would indeed have made no sound at all as they fell into the treasury. But, said Jesus, her gift was far greater than any of the others. They gave out of their wealth, but she gave out of her poverty, all she had. The Lord is not impressed with outward show if it obscures an inward lack of virtue. Psalm 127 tells us that unless the Lord builds the house, its builders labour in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchmen stand guard in vain. If what we do is not rooted in our faith and service of God, it will not ultimately succeed. That is a message for Remembrance Day. We're living in a world of war. Wars have been waged almost since the world began, and our century is no exception. One might imagine, as mankind becomes more advanced in understanding technology, scientific development, and what is called civilization, that wars would be rare occurrences. But humans still resort to war, even though experience tells us that the loss war causes is almost always greater than any gains. Our century soon proved true to the usual form with the reaction to 9/11. Rather than pausing to consider why we in the West had drawn such fire, our government immediately made plans to invade Iraq, even though there was no proof that the perpetrators of the attack on the Twin Towers belonged there, or that Iraq was storing weapons of mass destruction. The result was an illegal war that destabilised the Middle East, and which had further spin-offs, including the Afghan War. We're still suffering from the fallout of those wars. And last October, an act of terrorism perpetrated by Hamas instigated a backlash from Israel that has escalated into a war on civilians, causing unprecedented suffering and loss of life. The conflict risks turning a much more widespread war that could endanger millions. Dan Jarvis, an MP with military experience, recently commented very perceptively that terrorist organisations cannot compete in an armed conflict with major powers. Therefore, they seek to provoke a strategic overreaction. This is exactly what happened following 9/11 and the Hamas attack. In Britain, we remain deeply grateful for those who gave their lives to protect us in the dark days of the Second World War. And we remember those often innocent young men and women who were drawn into fighting in the First World War and in far more recent conflicts. War memorials stand as stark reminders of the lost lives of those sent into battle by commanders who may well have remained safely at home or well behind enemy lines. We must not forget, but we must not glorify war, any more than we glorify those who are ruining our planet through greed, while making virtue signals with grand gestures that cost them nothing. God is not fooled by the ways of humans. He sees what is in our hearts, and it was for our folly, pride, and sinfulness that Christ had to die in order to save us. In the letter to the Hebrews, the writer was seeking to demonstrate how vastly superior was the Christian faith over Judaism. And in our passage today, he's showing how the principle of blood sacrifice was fulfilled once for all in Jesus Christ. Just before our reading, the letter states that the Jewish law claimed, "Without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness." He speaks of the tabernacle and its accoutrements, which had to be purified with the blood of animal sacrifices, as being copies of the heavenly things. But the heavenly things themselves need far better sacrifices, and this would be the sacrifice that Jesus made. Jesus is described as entering not into a man-made tabernacle, but into heaven itself, God's presence. Just as on Atonement Day the high priest entered the Holy of Holies, bearing the blood of sacrificial bulls to atone for Israel's sins, Jesus entered heaven and offered himself as a sacrifice for our sins. Jesus, however, did not need to repeat his sacrifice. It was once for all that he made his offering. Neither war nor formal legalistic religion is the way to solve the problems of the human race. However, we have a Redeemer, the Prince of Peace, who has given his life that we might live, and who will indeed bring an end to wars, death, and suffering when he returns to establish his kingdom. Christ is looking for those who will serve him wholeheartedly, motivated by love. Remember how he watched those donating into the temple treasury. and perceived the greatest sacrifices, even though to human eyes they would have appeared worthless. We must remember our worth to Jesus, to give sacrificially, generously if we can afford to, but knowing that he will value our service and our giving, however small, for we ourselves were bought at a price.